It's time to get started. We are here in the Nutmeg Tavern. We are live, and we have a super show today. We just thought it was so super, we better get started just a little bit early. So if you're only just here on time, you're going to have to back up and see the beginning. Welcome into the Nutmeg Tavern. I'm your host, John Townsend, and we're going to be talking about fun 18th century poison stuff today. And I'm joined by Lauren, who's in the chat.
Hello.
And Ivy, who's on the console.
Hi, everybody.
I don't know where they are in the time vortex, but they're making it happen. And I'm here on this side in the 18th century in the tavern. You can come on in, have a seat, relax, enjoy, get out your favorite mug of whatever you like to drink during late Friday afternoon. And so today's episode is on poison. Like Nutmeg Cooking Club says, I sense there are a lot of disclaimers today. Well, let me tell you, disclaimers. Don't poison anybody. Don't eat any poison. And none of this that we're going to be talking about is medical advice or legal advice. Any of those things. They're just like, another thing to touch on here is, people in the 18th century, medicinally or otherwise can seem silly, but like 90% of the medicines we use today are poisons in one form or another. You take too many of them, it'll kill you. So, they had medicines in the 18th century that were poisons, just straight up poisons. I don't know if they had any medicinal purpose whatsoever, but, and maybe some of our medicines today are too. So anyway, be careful. Poison. It's bad for you. A lot of different kinds of poisons going on in the 18th century. And some of them were obvious, some of them were not so obvious. They were learning about a lot of this stuff in the 18th century. So, they're trying to discover things. Some are being used nefariously, and some people are getting poisoned by accident. So we've got poisoned in the workplace, and just all sorts of circumstances where poison kind of comes in here. And so we're going to kind of jump around with a lot of different poison topics here today. And as I was researching this, as usual, I was running down rabbit holes everywhere. So it'll be scattered, but it's going to be chock full of good poison in the episode today. And while you're drinking stuff, make sure it's not poison. So if we're going to start off with criminal poisonings, and we do have some of that going on, what is the poison of choice in the 18th century for, getting rid of your annoying person that you want to, or maybe an annoying animal in your life? That happens too. In one of these circumstances, someone wants to rob a place. There is the owner has a dog, and they decide they're going to kill the dog with poison. And that ends up in one of the Old Bailey cases. I can't remember if they were guilty or not guilty on that one. Do you remember what the verdict was on that?
I don't remember the verdict on that one. I think it was guilty.
Oh, there we go. Anyway, so the poison of choice for most people in the 18th century was arsenic. And we're all kind of familiar with arsenic being that classic poison we will see in movies and television, especially in the let's say mystery novels of, say, the early 20th century or something like that. Agatha Christie, what are they going to get poisoned with? Probably arsenic. But by Agatha Christie's time, arsenic wasn't the big thing go-to on poisons, because arsenic was something that they could fairly easily identify, or very easily identify, and also it was being somewhat controlled, because in the 18th century and early 19th century, arsenic was the choice. In fact, we really don't have any great idea how many people were poisoned in that time period, because there's no good way for them to test for arsenic poisoning. wasn't until, say, 1836 or so that Marsh comes up with his really good test, real fast and easy. In fact, not just a I can test whether it's present there, but I can actually test how much there is kind of test. And that really gets kind of important. It's one thing to say, yeah, there's some tiny, trace amount of something, or there's enough there to kill somebody. That's a test that's really useful. So Marsh was the guy who comes up with the test in 1836, and he comes up with that test. He's driven to make that test because in like 1832, he was called upon as someone, as an expert witness to say, yes, he did a test and arsenic was found in a particular situation. But when he came to bring the results to the court, it was hard to see that it was really there. I don't know, he brought like a violin or something, and it had been done days before. And so it was like, well, what is that? What does that really say to me? I can't tell whether that's really, arsenic or not. And so he worked on developing a test that was like, this will show that's arsenic and how much there is. Before the 1830s, there were only kind of semi-helpful tests for arsenic. So you could test for the presence by burning it, and if you got a smell of something that smelled possibly like garlic, you could say, yeah, maybe that's arsenic.
Well, and not just arsenic, but poisoning in general. They talked about doing autopsies and having the doctors look at the insides of the person who was dead, and they're like, see this particular type of irritation or coloration, it's like it's poison. So that was one way. It wasn't as conclusive as this is arsenic, but it was helpful.
And if you look in some of these British criminal trials, you can look on the Old Bailey, you can see the testimony there. And in the vast majority of the cases, it seems like the court really leans towards kind of acquitting people unless there's really good proof. And it's really kind of hard to prove that someone got poisoned unless, it's like, I saw them pouring white powder into a thing and they maliciously wanted to do that. Because you can accidentally put poison stuff in. You can, you didn't know it was poison. Nobody actually saw you do it. You can't find, there's all kinds of, just circumstantial evidence isn't enough. In fact, the French had a term for arsenic. What was it? Powder of inheritance.
Yeah, inheritance. Inheritance powder.
Powder of inheritance. So it's like, wow. That's pretty neat. So if we go look in the Old Bailey records, we will not find that many cases brought forward for arsenic poisoning. And even those, many of them are acquitted or found not guilty. Now, there is a famous kind of case happening in the early 19th century, the Elizabeth Fanning case, and I've got Elizabeth Fanning.
That's the poison dumpling, right?
Yes, that's the poison dumpling case, and she was actually found guilty and executed somewhere in the 1810s. This particular thing is like an elaborate investigation into it in 1815. And she was a maid. She was working for a family. There was some disputes. I mean, every kind of employee-employer kind of relationship sometimes is, In this kind of case, they thought maybe she had some unhappiness with the family, and she's accused of poisoning dumplings. So she was made some dumpling dough and was going to put it into the thing and boil up with the stew or whatever it is. And she makes up this dough, and it doesn't rise. In fact, it's black and hard and dense, and they use it anyway. And the dumplings are supposed to come out white and fluffy, and these are dark and dense. They eat them anyway, and they get really, really sick. And they accuse this maid of doing it on purpose. As they dig into the court case, and it really does not seem like they really should have done. It looked like they really depended on some, like the doctor testimony who said, "Oh, I looked in there, I found arsenic." which I'm not sure at this point there was a really good test for it. And he even, he said, yes, it turned the knife black, and so therefore it was arsenic. And even though that arsenic doesn't really do that to the knives, I don't know.
Well, and you definitely, the person who was writing the pamphlet
Yeah.
was doing that for a reason. He felt
Right.
that it had been mishandled. That's why he took all the
Right.
time and effort to write the pamphlet.
Exactly. So if you want a lot more information on this case, I did a live stream over on Townsend's journal, and there's a link down in the description section. It's called Poison Dumplings, and it's got anyway, you can find that.
Right, I put it in the chat. It's down there.
Yeah, you can
find it.
check that out. I spent like a half hour talking about poor Elizabeth Fenning and her case there. It's funny because I was researching at the time people sending food out to be baked at the bakers, and that whole case popped up. So you never know where you're gonna find out. So let's see. Marsh. It was James Marsh who comes up with the test, and his test in some form or another continued to be used up into the 1970s for that. Now apparently after the 1970s they came up with more sophisticated tests for arsenic, but after this 1836, and I don't think his test really gets tested in court until the 1840s, but after this test becomes available, people decide that maybe arsenic isn't the best thing to poison people with because it's so easily detected at this point. And so it kind of lowers the amount of arsenic poisonings because of that. So, and arsenic was very common in the household. People would have it lying around to poison rodents and rats and mice and things like that. And you would also use it industrially. So you'd use it for refining metals, or kind of getting rid of the dross in metals. So it's used in different kind of applications. So arsenic was kind of hanging around, and you could just go down to the chemists and buy it wherever. What was a common thing in the 18th century to just, it's like, oh, I need some rat poison, I'll go down there, I'll get some arsenic, no problem. And there was one case where it kind of there was a possible poisoning, and they question the chemist, and they say, so you just sell this poison to people you don't know? So even though there wasn't you've got to put your name on the list here if you're going to buy arsenic.
Although there would be later.
There would be later. Yes, exactly. They start to kind of regulate that. Even though there wasn't at the time, you could tell the court was like, you shouldn't just be selling this poison to anybody willy-nilly. Strange people coming in and buying arsenic, that's not a good idea. You shouldn't be doing that. So, very, very interesting thing going on with arsenic. And again, that's the classic for poisoning people. But there was another poison case here. Let me see if I can find him. No. Captain somebody. I didn't have time to pull up the full case notes on this guy, but he ends up poisoning somebody with cherry laurel.
Oh.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
So he specifically, takes the time to make a specific cherry laurel, and laurel is like, think bay leaves. So there were some leaves that looked like bay leaves, maybe even related to bay leaves, because bay leaf I think is in the laurel family, but it was poisonous, and it'll even show up in some of the other. There's a whole book on poisons that was written in 1775, and a laurel is in there. It doesn't spend a whole bunch of time on that, but that was used in a crime there, and I think the captain was convicted in the 1780s for poisoning someone, probably because he was interested in the guy's wife. I think, I don't know. There's a picture of it. I think it's in there. That's that third slide. Not that one. That one. Yes. Captain Donnellan. There we go. He's rinsing the bottle after poisoning this.
A dramatic recreation of the event.
Yes. Da, 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 da. You can see, poor guy, he's dead over there in the bed. And you can see on the table the classic medicine bottles. And apparently, they poisoned the poor guy. Because there you go. So it's happening. It's happening in the 18th century. We also had that one case about the person poisoning the dog. And because they wanted to rob somebody. Yeah, that just doesn't seem very nice.
They mentioned that there were a couple of those in the Old Bailey where they were talking about that people would specifically have guard dogs, and that was kind of, if you wanted to round them, there wasn't much else you could do to the dog first, but poisoning was kind of their first step.
There was a very interesting case of poisoning that had to do with a particular sailor and a customs house official. They're like on the ship, but at in port, and they're having guests in, and they're making is it punch that they're making? No, it was flip. They're making flip with beer and sugar and brandy, and this sailor he says, "Oh, I've got this." What did he want? They wanted to use it instead of lemons.
Yes, so they wanted to have a sour taste. At least that's what he was. That's what he said it was for.
He wanted to spike this stuff with something that was going to make it a little spicier, right? And he said that he thought it was laudanum.
Right. Which it was very strange because oddly in the Old Bailey records, you would expect to see the prisoner examined, but a lot of times that part at least isn't recorded in what we're reading. So
right. I think they just choose to not.
Yeah.
They choose to not defend themselves and just say they didn't make the case basically. And in this case, even though there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of testimony, they made this drink. People would drink it. They get really sick. They drink more of it, and basically, it seemed like they couldn't prove that this guy, number one, he got it from somebody else.
He did get it and brought it with him. And it seemed to be that they couldn't prove he knew what it was and maliciously gave it to specifically hurt this one guy.
And somebody did die from that.
He did. But there were at least like 5 people who drank it.
And apparently he even drank some of it. The person who, in theory, so he apparently innocently brought the...
At least they just...
And they couldn't even prove that the guy who died even drank the stuff, could they?
I think they were like, we thought he did, but no one would say that they saw him drink like from the cup. They're like, we're pretty sure he did. I thought so, but no one could say, I definitely remember seeing him drink some for sure. They knew he had a glass of it. They just weren't sure about the drinking.
So, it's really interesting. Now, there's a section here in the Law Dictionary in the 18th century that talks about poisoning. And they say poisoning, the killing of a person by poisoning has been held more criminal than any other murder because of its secrecy, which prevents all defenses against it, whereas most open murders give the party killed some opportunity of resistance. So poisoning people is worse than going out and knifing them or something. They couldn't define themselves. It's one of those secret behind your back kind of murders. And of course, in that same way, it's it's not strength against it. It's kind of it's sneaky and weak people can do it. Like the maid could easily kill her master with poisoning because he's not looking. So very interesting that they would kind of classify those in a different way. So sneaky.
It's so interesting to me that this is here in the dictionary definition or the law dictionary where it's giving that particular detail in that type of book.
Yeah, a special kind of treason for that. Now, I don't have a lot of other like malicious kind of poisoning. Can you think of any other of those malicious kind of poisonings? other materials that they would use for that? Lauren did a lot of the research too. So
Arsenic really seemed to be the poison of choice.
Right.
And I there were some others dotted around in there, but not consistent ones.
right, we think of things like strychnine. That's a later time period. There are some cyanide type things that are going on, but generally those tend to be an earlier thing. So the cyanide that's in cherry pits or in different like fruit pips, apricot seeds. Sometimes they would use those to poison people. I think some of those are early like Caesar kind of. Roman
there's
emperor
plenty of
people
Roman.
would poison people
absolutely.
that way. I was like, all right, classic. And of course, how are you going to prove it? And maybe that's why they choose those. We see that they know about a lot of these kinds of poisons. If we look in that Prestwich's dissertation on mineral, animal, vegetable poisons, which is written in 1775, and he's got poisons that are listed as metallic poisons, so mineral poisons, cobalt, arsenic, mercury, lead, antimony, and then we have vegetable poisons. That one I don't recognize. Hemlock, henbane, nightshades, and some of these other ones, deadly carrot, the Canada flat lemon tree, which I'm not familiar with, flea plant, wolf's bane. Some of them are specifically medicinal in their, there's hellebore, which there's possibly some that are straight up poisonous, other ones that they were using for medicine. Opium is here as a poison, but also obviously as medicine. Bitter almonds, one of those ones that is in the time period sometimes used you'll find that in cookbooks. They'll mix it, bitter almonds and regular almonds, but bitter almond is poisonous. Then there's the kernel of black cherries and some other ones. Very rarely do we see, or at least they try to, maybe in the time period people did maliciously poison people with these things. It's just, it was hard to prove that they didn't do that by accident, like maybe poisonous mushrooms. I don't know that there's any good way.
It's hard to say. You're like, I did not know that one was poisonous.
Right.
But there is, somebody had put, so do you mind if I segue into Super Chats a little bit so I don't get, okay, so hold on just a second while I find them. Okay.
She lost them.
I know. They have their own little special tab, but there they are. Okay. So the first one is from Race Jacobson. This came right after the caveat at the beginning. And he said, instructions unclear. Hemlock and jalapeno stuck up nose. Oh no. And then this is Macaroni Gluer Games. Was there much evidence of people using mushrooms for poison, of people making their own poisons from common natural sources?
Right. So good question, and I don't have any proof of it.
Right? And like that seems to be very, when it's these more natural poisons, it's just hard to tell. You're like, I don't know if they do it on purpose.
And the other tricksy thing here is that we only have so many of these 18th century court records that we have available to us online. So much of that stuff hasn't necessarily been scanned in so that it's easily searchable. So it may very well be, there if we went through the original documents and were, pour through and find those court cases. And some of that stuff is lost. I'm sure there's some interesting accusations out there.
So this one's from Diane Norcus. First time in the tavern since Hurricane Helene visited Augusta. I'm glad you could make it. So Dr. Benjamin Rush provided Lewis and Clark with pills containing mostly mercury. Did they know the dangers of injecting mercury?
They didn't inject mercury, but they would use...
It could have been it might have been ingest. And that could have been
probably,
autocorrect.
yeah. They had, I even have a section here on mercury. In fact, Benjamin Rush. Yeah, Benjamin Rush apparently was a big mercury fan. And they would have mercury as an ointment. They would have mercury as multiple different kinds of things. So straight up the metal, which is not as, let's say, detrimental to you as other ones. We would have mercury supplements, mercury vapors, mercury salts. They all, of course, poison, but they had different things going on with them. So let me see if I can find the Benjamin Rush thing. I have too many pieces of paper here.
True.
Come here, Benjamin. There was a great quote. I couldn't find the original quote for it, but it is, but referenced multiple times on the web. Now that doesn't mean it's always right. Yeah. So here's Benjamin Rush, and he's talking about using mercury for people that are hysterical. So this is just, mental kind of stuff. Mercury acts in this disease by abstracting morbid excitement from the brain to the mouth, by removing visceral obstructions, and by changing the cause of our patient's complaints and fixing them wholly upon his sore mouth. The salivation will still do more service if it excites some degree of resentment against the patient's physician or friends. It's like, oh, they're kind of sad. I'll make them mad at me by
this will work great.
Poisoning them. So I've talked about this in a different episode over on Townsend's Journal, where Nicholas Creswell is ill at the beginning of his journey in probably 1774. He comes over to the New World. He's not feeling well. A doctor comes and visits him and prescribes him some pills, and he gets violently ill. And it turns out, after a couple of days, he's just getting worse and worse. Every time he takes the pills, he feels even worse. The doctor comes and sees him. He looks at the pills and goes, whoops, and he had been giving him mercury pills when that wasn't the intention. Nicholas Creswell finds out, and he punches the guy right in the face. He's really mad at him, really, really mad at him. Maybe he was taking the Benjamin Rush advice here. I don't know.
I'm not sure. He's like, the second part was great.
By getting him really bad at it. It takes Nicholas Creswell a while to recover from his mercury poisoning via the doctor. He even goes on a sea voyage trying to cure himself of being nearly killed by the physician. So, all these things they understood here, in 1775, they're, trying to, kind of illuminate all these different poisonous things. They even have here a specific little section on poisonous mushrooms. And there's a lovely section in the London Art of Cookery where he goes on about mushrooms. And let me see if I can find that.
So while you're looking at that,
yes.
Somebody had put in Jello sends in a member chat that says, "Can the bag a potion is carried in poison the bag?" And of course, it would depend on what it was being carried in. Right. Contact, would it, if it was strong enough. But it reminded me of a story, and this is the calico printer's jug story. So there was a particular person in the 18th century, it's not specific about the time frame, who went to go borrow a stone jug, and she filled it with water, and she and a group of other women had tea and using it. And then one of them died, the granddaughter died, and then they smashed the bottle and they found that it had white arsenic stuck in the bottom and on the sides. And so the calico printer, the person who had owned the jug, had used it in his work. And so I'm sure whoever had loaned it out to them had no idea that that was going to be a problem at all. But there were certainly times where you would have contact poison like that totally accidentally.
Right. And so on the mushroom thing, mushrooms have long been used in sauces, in ketchup, and other forms of cookery. They're highly esteemed by the Romans, as they are at present by the French, Italians, and other nations. Pliny exclaims against the luxury of his countrymen in this article and wonders what extraordinary pleasure there can be in eating such a dangerous food. The ancient writers on the Materia Medica seem to agree that mushrooms are in general unwholesome. And the moderns, and he mentions a bunch of different, basically plant people, botanists and whatever, are of the same opinion. There are numerous instances on record of their fatal effects, and almost all authors agree that they are fraught with poison. The common kinds, if eaten too freely, bring on heartburns, sickness, vomitings, diarrhea, dysentery, and other dangerous symptoms. If therefore it is wished that they be banished from the table. But if the palate must be indulged in these treacherous gratifications, or as Seneca calls them, this voluptuous poison, it is necessary that those who are employed in collecting them should be extremely cautious, lest they should collect such as are absolutely pernicious, which, considering sorry, it's hard to read this. He goes on to describe finding button mushrooms. It's like, well, you should look for them. They should be round. They should be like buttons and top performance stalks and all that. You gotta be really careful of the poisoned mushrooms. Okay. Let me see if I can find where I want to go here.
So,
yes.
Speed and Style, Tony sends in a super chat and says, I would assume that there were plenty of accidental poisonings with lack of understanding of hazardous chemicals. And this certainly was very evident when we were reading the sections about lead.
Yeah.
Because there was this one particular town where they were talking about, they did lead processing there. Like, that's what one of the industries in the town. And they're like, well, it's a great town. It's not really a problem, except for, the cattle do die.
Yeah.
Very...
Here's the reading here. Mr. Glanville observes that the smoke of the lead works at Mendip in Somersetshire is a prodigious annoyance. I like that. An annoyance. And subjects both the workmen and the cattle that graze about them to a mortal disease. The trees that grow near them have burnt tops, and their leaves and the outsides discolor and are scorched. And then it goes on to talk about how all the dogs and the animals die around there, and the children of the workers die.
I feel like maybe connecting the dots would be a good idea.
It's like, I'll bet it's not good for the workers either.
No.
Maybe you shouldn't do it at all. So here's a whole section on lead in the, this is the 1738 encyclopedia at the time. And the only section here that really talks about lead being bad was that little section there. It's like, oh yeah, sometimes the cattle die. Here's what they're using lead for. So they use lead dust. The potters use it to make their glazes. They have burnt lead. It's a chemical preparation used in medicine. Then there's white lead used by painters to make white paint, basically. Red lead preparation, again used by painters, potters, and physicians. Then there's sugar of lead, an essential salt of vinegar, incorporating your incorporating lead. Balm of lead, or Saturn, is an oil drawn from the salt of lead by distillation. And Magistry of lead. It is a calyx, or a calx of lead purified and subulized. It is made of lead dissolved in aquafortis, which is nitric acid, and pouring a filtrated salt water into it, which they use lotions that you put on your face and fix your complexion. So if you want to have a nice white complexion, you can use that. And then black lead for a black coloring. And so they have all these kinds of leads that they used. And somewhere here I've got a section on the salt, the sugar of lead. Yeah, now this is 1753. After that, lead ore is of a poisonous nature, especially with regards to brutes. They who live near where it is washed can neither keep dog nor cat nor any sort of fowl, but they all die in a short time. Not only calves, but even children have been known to be killed by only being in the houses where lead ore has been kept some time. And if any sort of cattle feed upon the grass on which the stream which rises from the melting of lead falls, they all die soon after. It's just like, oh, okay.
Well, and one of the things that probably should not surprise me is that it took quite some time. Like, here we have quite a bit of knowledge of the fact that this is quite dangerous to have around, even in small quantities, and that it really takes a long time for its practicality to be outweighed by how dangerous it is to have around.
Right. Well, I mean, we were still putting it in gasoline in the 1970s.
Very true.
So here is the Plain English Dispensatory, 1753, same book. This is on sugar of lead. Sugar of lead is very cooling and drying. It may be safely and successfully used to hot, fiery breakings out of the skin. Being mixed with pomatum or any cooling ointment, mixed with rose water, it makes a good medicine for inflamed eyes. The same will afford considerable relief when injected for an infectious running of the reins. Don't ask me, I'm not going to tell you. But as to the inward use of lead, there is hardly a more deceitful or more destructive poison. Maybe it's not so good on the outside either. Anyway, they were using it for all sorts of wonderful things. While we're here at the halfway mark, every week we try to get to the supporters, the direct supporters here on the live stream. Of course, we have the wonderful super chats. There's also YouTube membership. Sometimes when you see those great little Townsend emojis, you guys can punch in Townsend emojis here, and that's something the members get. There's new and renewing this week. Michael Shirtleff, Northern Wolf, Dirty Mick 2, David Collar of Casper's Coins and Jewelry, Abraham Ratharock, Oscar Clip Sr., The Brandon Show, Lottie, Anthony Quasigro, and Jennifer Bush. And we had a brand new Patreon person called Wheelchair Ninja, I think. So super thank you to you folks there that are direct, super exact supporters. So thank you so much for that. There, look at that. There it is. There's Mikey Mike and Speed and Style Tony. Just emojifying. Is that a verb? Something?
Mm-hmm. Let's say it is. It's a verb now. So somebody was asking about the information. So there is a link in the description that has, it's sort of where we tossed all our links when we were doing research. So there's a lot there. It might not have everything, but there is quite a bit there, along with some other fun stuff.
Thank you for those gift memberships I saw there. Was that UPOPs? UPOPs
Yes,
215?
Yopop 215.
Okay. So obviously some of these poisonings that we have, we talked about the nefarious, on-purpose poisonings, and some of these we've been talking about here were kind of mistake poisonings, or from different kinds of plants, different people accidentally poisoning themselves. Another kind of poisoning that happens is culinary poisonings, where it is kind of obvious that it should have been figured out that it was a poison. And again, the art of cookery really comes in and gives us some really good information. London Art of Cookery. And he has the first section of the appendix is basically multiple pages about what's going on with accidental culinary poisonings. Specifically, he really spends a lot of time on the copper vessels that they used in the time period. So sometimes on the channel you will see I will be using a little copper saucepan. And the copper saucepan and the brass kettles that I cook in. Both of those you can get some serious copper poisoning from. And some people understood this more than others in the time period. I think it was the Swiss. Was it the Swiss? Somewhere in Northern Europe. They kind of figured this out early, and they outlawed copper vessels in the middle of the 18th century and said, you just can't use it. So the classic kettles that we see, the sort of, we think of them as cast iron kettles. We might say, like, that's a witch's cauldron, right? That classic style in the 17th century was made of brass or bronze. And those were real common. Also, we have pasnets, or basically little saucepans of the time period, 17th century and early 18th century. Those are usually made of bell metal or brass. Also, sometimes bronze, depending on what you're using. And a lot of the thin vessels that we're using were copper. And any of those that don't have a lining in them can get a copper salt. You'll get something like copper sulfate, and that is poisonous. And he spends a lot of time talking about this, and he even says that that we should just plain outlaw them. He was like, we should outlaw them. And the copper salts that he talks about here is called verdigris, and that classic kind of greeny blue color that's on there. If that's on the inside, it will poison you. And there's even a section in, I think it's the prison, one of the prison ship things where the prisoners are talking about being fed out of these, basically everything's being cooked in these copper vessels, and they're just all full of verdigris. I mean, it's just they don't bother to clean them at all. And he, it's like you got to be really careful when you're cleaning your copper stuff that it is completely free of this. And anytime, some of these are riveted together, or they have handles riveted on them, and all those little cracks and crevices can get that verdigris in there, and you basically can't clean it out. And if you have any food that has any acidic nature in it at all, it will eat that stuff up, then it'll be in the food, and it'll poison you. And even if you just sort of leave the food in the pot for a while. So, you might cook something and just leave it in the pot, serve out of it, and then maybe the next meal you'll serve, out of it, and it's just been cold in that. Well, it has been, eating up those copper salts, and even if it doesn't have copper salts, the acids in the food will bring the copper in, and it'll poison it. And he's like, why do we continue to have this copper here that continues to poison people a little bit all the time? Water, by standing some time in a copper vessel, becomes impregnated with verdigris, and it may be demonstrated. He talks about showing that is. There are even different dishes that they would specifically do in copper so that the item that they're making will turn green. And that is very scary. So sometimes they would do like pickles pickled cucumbers. It's like, well, we want those to be really bright green, so we'll make sure to cook them in this copper vessel.
It'll be great.
It'll be great. And pickles have, of course, acid in them. It's like, yeah, it'll be green, all right. Verdigris is one of the most violent poisons in nature, and yet rather than quit an old custom, the greater part of mankind is content to swallow some of this poison every day. So he was really unhappy. And he goes on to talk about other kinds of vessels that will also poison us. So one of the ways that you'll try to fix copper vessels is by tinning them on the inside, and all the ones we use are tinned on the inside. But he even complains about that you can still, that the copper will come through the tin, or you'll get a little holes in the tin, and then the copper will be exposed, etc. Then he goes on to talk about lead and the problems we have with lead. Now, of course, we know about pewter being in the time period having lead in it, and you might have acidic foods and would pull the lead out of your copper, but there's also lead in the in any kind of ceramics that used lead in the glaze. And if you had acids, again, they would sort of eat into the glaze and try to extract the leads out of that. Now, sometimes, in theory, lead glazes are pretty safe if they're fired at a high enough temperature and that's locked into the glass. But I'm sure acids over a great period of time will try to extract that lead anyway. And in the time period, they couldn't control the firing of their pottery the way we can today, making sure it's always in a particular kind of atmosphere and oxidizing instead of reducing atmosphere. So it's undoubtedly much more possible that their glazes would be susceptible to having the lead leached out of them. So there's redware that you would see that was red with a clear glaze. That was a lead glaze. Sometimes you would see white items that had basically a white clay but still had a lead glaze on the outside. Even the Delft ware. I don't have a piece of Delft. Here it is. Oh, like this, the little white pots with the blue on them. In the time period, this glaze had lead in it, so those things were used in culinary purposes all the time. The lead could be pulled out of it. And then he goes on to say what you really need to use is Staffordshire ware, which would be a white with salt glaze. Like this has got a salt glaze on it. The salt glaze doesn't have any lead in it, and so it's a lot safer. So lead's going to poison people. And I mean, he goes into a lot saying he knows that the lead, even in the glazing, is bad for you, much less, putting it in your food. Sometimes they would, in theory, a bad baker would put white lead in the bread to make it whiter. It could be that doesn't happen as often as, that's censorious.
Kind of a high end.
Yeah, it's like, we're gonna make this sound like it's happening every day, but might not. I don't know how reputable the bakers were. So he goes on to talk about Delft. He also mentions specifically using China and imported China because there's no lead in that glaze, and that's safe for things. He's not even really all that happy with China that's made in Europe at the time period. It's like, they're...
But China from China, he's like,
yeah, China from China,
that's good.
yeah. Because they're always using very, very, porcelains with very high temperatures. There's no lead in the glaze at all. It's really, the glazes are made of a type of clay that turns into the glaze versus who knows what, those disreputable Europeans that are trying to make their fake China.
So we're going to do a slight train. We're going to do a rabbit track.
Yes.
Okay. So Rob Dixon was saying that the annual Fort de Chartres event.
Fort de Chartres.
Thank you. I'm like, is this French? What? How do you pronounce this one? Thank you. It's there's the Winter Rendezvous and Woods Walk this weekend, and I dropped the link in from the reenacting schedule, but I'm going to do it again.
Right. So if you're interested in other events that might be happening in your area, make sure to check out reenactorsschedule.net.
Org, I think? Yes.
Whatever it is. We never get it right. Good thing we can drop a link in every single time. Because who can remember? So what else do we have here? He talked about the mushrooms, so we already got about that. There also he does mention laurel in this particular section about being careful about making sure it's a real laurel or bay leaf. We use bay leaves today, and that's
that's the good stuff. That's
right,
the good
that's
laurel.
the real laurel, and then there's the, I think I've got a laurel tree in my backyard. Oh, no, now you're poisoned. And there's questions here about, whether it seems like, he's confused a little in the time period about what the real laurel is and what it isn't, and so he might even give the advice. If you're not really sure about that laurel, don't use it, right? If you're not sure about that bay leaf, you can live
I bet that's why he was
live without the flavor. Don't worry.
He does seem of a cautious temperament. Which,
Yeah. Well,
when you're dealing with safety, food safety, that's
right.
And we were talking earlier today about how, despite all these people mentioning poisons, and they really weren't talking about food spoilage very much.
Right.
Even
And
though
all
they
those
dealt with
things. Food spoilage is, just so, and so bad for people today. A lot of people, it kind of sneaks up on you. It kills people with botulism and other kinds of toxins that just are really, strange. Something that it's like, well, this thing went bad, but it's not that bad, and the person dies. So it happens. Of course, we have a lot of people on the earth, and a lot of people. We hear about one story of somebody getting poisoned by bad food, and we, of course, think it's happening all the time. And it is in one way, and it isn't in another. So I don't know. I don't know how to explain that.
Right.
I didn't explain that.
And
very well.
sometimes you wonder whether they might be sometimes they would use a phrase, and for them it would mean a little bit more than it would mean to us. And sometimes, after a while, we figure it out, and sometimes we still haven't. You're like, what?
In the time period, I think people were getting sick from bad food all the time, and they just expected it. They didn't really think about it. It's like, I really shouldn't eat that.
But also, if I went back and ate their food with the food safety, I probably would get much more sick from it than they would.
Right. They probably had some pretty powerful guts.
That's right. Their biome was doing a good job.
We have wimpy guts today. So there was that one with the captain who's poisoning somebody. They did have special antidotes, and there's the story. Now this isn't the
Caesar's?
Right, this isn't Caesar's.
His was plantain and horsehound, I think, were the main ingredients.
Right, but this is, from a manuscript cookbook in the 18th century, how to make an antidote against poison or infection. I mean, hey.
Why not?
Or this bottom one, for French pox, plague, fever, smallpox, measles, or any infectious disease. A little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then ta-da! There's a lot of stories about fixes, antidotes like this for snake bite and for other things that we find in the 18th century. Many of them coming from a Native American. It's like, we think the Native Americans have this cure for XYZ, right? Whatever it is. And, they would talk about that, you'd see sort of little references to that. It was always this far off nebulous, they have a fix for this. So there's an interesting, Caesar was he
was a doctor. He was an enslaved doctor in South Carolina. And there's not a ton of information about him personally, but they have records of this particular transaction because it happened. It went through the legislature. So they have records of this particular what happened, and he was very well known and respected in the area, and he was very well known for curing poison cases or people suffering from that type of problem. And the legislator was they were like, okay, can we buy this from you? How can we make this happen? And he's like, I'd like to be freed, and I would like to have this much money per year. And he was already 67.
Right.
But and then so it kind of talks about how that process happened through the legal system.
So they do.
Yes.
They do free him. They give him the money, and then they publish the recipe.
Right, and they
for
try
it.
to kind of spread
Right.
out as widely as they can through newspapers and everything.
Right. Very interesting. Now, I don't know that it ever cured anybody, but that whole concept of, yeah, we're the government and we actually want to, buy this and release it. Do we have any closing kind of?
Okay, yes. Okay, so I have a super chat from Max Harkle, and it is, for reals, as a little kid, mid-70s, I used to chew lead paint chips because they tasted sweet. Probably explains a lot. Stay safe, kids.
Right. Well, there's a reason why they call it sugar of lead. They would use it to sweeten things.
Well, and my grandma tells a story about, she grew up in New England, and their community had quite a few older houses in it, and in the kind of one of the outbuildings that was torn down, there were kind of leftover things, and they had stored thermometers there for some reason. There was a good reason, I can't recall what it is at the moment, but they were mercury thermometers, and she would play with the mercury because you would as a kid,
it was
right?
fun.
You're like,
Oh, yeah.
it's so fun.
Yeah. Mercury, you would play
And
with it,
you're like, but don't do that either, kids. That's dangerous too.
Well, I know somebody who used to chew on solder.
Delicious. So, and then here's a super chat from Jello. Best way to visually identify lookalikes. And I believe this is mushrooms. I think this is probably from out of that.
Well, I mean, he specifically says, look for button mushrooms because they're easily identifiable and they're safe, right? In the same way, we around here look for morels because there are false morels, but they don't look like morels.
And if the stem's the right way,
right.
You've
If the
got
stem
the
is
right,
hollow,
and there is a reason. You're like, we look for these mushrooms because it's not just because they taste the best. It's because you're unlikely to get one of the very poisonous other ones. So
now the funny story was out east when Whitney's mother lived, or they would go out there. Of course, Indiana, it's like, oh, we're all going to eat morels. It was 50 years away or whatever. They went out to Maine, and there are all these morels growing in the yard. And he's like, look at all these amazing morels. Let's eat them.
Let's eat them.
And the people out there were like, no, those are deadly poison.
They're
They'll kill
mushrooms. You don't
eat. You can't eat those. I'm like, what are you talking about? This is the best mushroom ever.
So it is difficult, and I don't. It's hard to find a surefire way of knowing that you have just the right mushroom, other than making sure to. I usually like to be learning it from somebody face to face who has a deep knowledge of mushrooms.
Someone you really, really trust.
Yes.
There are some amazing mushrooms out there. Chicken of the woods and morels and apparently chanterelles, which we don't really have around here as far as I know. And
well, Govishin is saying, I just grow my own morels. And so that is a wonderful solution. And in the kitchen gardens, we were just doing this last couple live streams, they were talking about growing your own mushrooms. And I know you can do it now, and that you can make your own little mushroom bed, and that would be a great way to do it. Yeah. So I did have a question from somebody wondering what you thought the most interesting poison was, either in its effects or in its origin of the ones we kind of...
Well, I guess the most legendary one, and I didn't have time to really, super dig on it, is the upas tree, the poisonous upas tree. And there was sort of a legend that comes in. Yes?
If you fall asleep under the upas tree, you wake up dead.
That's right.
There's an effect for you.
So there was this odd sort of, it's around Java or some one of those Southeast Asia places where the upas tree was apparently supposed to grow, and in the 18th century, the legend came that if you were convicted, you could as sort of an out go and try to collect something from the upas tree instead of just being executed or whatever. And then there were these other legends about the upas tree that, it's like, for, 3 leagues around, for miles around, everything was dead under the upas tree, and of course, someone's saying, like, how would you know? You get so close to apparently, like, deadly poisonous air was supposed to come out of the upas tree, and it would just kill everybody around it. So that's why you don't want to fall asleep under an upas tree, obviously, or you'll wake up dead. Anyway, and there apparently, as time goes on, people actually find an upas tree. First, it's sort of legendary, and then the real upas tree kind of shows up, and it's not quite as deadly.
Not quite that deadly.
But apparently, there is some form of upas tree that is it's like
the kernel to that
gum
story.
out of it or something. I don't know what it is, but that's one of the most interesting poisonous tree kind of stories from the 18th century.
So somebody was wondering if there were references to the red tide, the shellfish poisoning that can happen in different times.
I didn't see any.
No, I didn't either. Like, he didn't caution about
right.
seafood or anything.
But again, that's like that bad, rotten food. You don't see any references to make sure you don't eat the hot dog that's 4 days old. They don't have any of that.
No.
Or well, maybe eating a 4-day-old hot dog won't kill you because it never goes bad. But let's just say the 4-day-old oyster that came out or whatever, or the strange coconut story that I saw anyway.
Very sad. Okay, so when you were talking about the upas tree and the exhalations, and it reminded me, we didn't get to talk about the caves. And
right.
It's okay.
They were talking about another kind of poison thing would be what's happening with different, they would call it exhalations from caves, other thing, kind of suffocation. They didn't know what was going on there, of course. It's like, is it a gas coming out of it, or is it, of course, lack of oxygen? Is it carbon monoxide? Is it radon gas, all these strange things. So they knew there were some underground issue that might kill people with poisonous gases too.
Okay.
Oh, wow. So big a topic, and it's kind of hard to kind of glaze over the top of them. Different stories about accidental and purposeful poisonings, very, very interesting topic, and it connects today with the things we don't realize that are poisons around us, or we buy things that are probably just as poisonous as arsenic today, and we really it's like, we know, be careful with that.
And we keep them in safe places,
right.
and in safe areas, and yeah,
all kinds of household chemicals that are just plain not good for you, and yet we use them all the time. So I guess we shouldn't, look upon them as being too silly in the time period. We just make different choices about what's dangerous or not dangerous to us. So incredibly fun to be in the tavern today, talking about kind of a scary topic, but one we should know about. So always good. And super thank you again to Patreon, to YouTube members, to people who are interested in merch, and the mugs. Well, we'll have a special announcement sometime coming up about mugs, and we've got coming up a special episode on the Spitjack episodes coming up on Sunday, and for you people getting ready. Because now Halloween's behind us. Thanksgiving's coming up.
That's right. It's coming right up.
And we will have, on the main channel, we will have a Thanksgiving marathon so that you can, set that in the background and see all kinds of fun Thanksgiving cooking stuff in the long time. You just let that run. You just let it cycle.
It gets you all ready for Thanksgiving.
Yeah, you just loop it in the background, let it run for the month of November. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Ivy. And all you folks out there that are here in the tavern today, thank you so much for coming in and spending time with us today. I hope you have a wonderful, non-poisonous weekend. Thank you for watching.